I need to start recording. Okay. So we're going to talk today a bit about kind of what makes American political culture what it is. We're going to talk about political knowledge, demographics, some of the issues we're facing. So we're going to do an introduction of how the class will go throughout the semester, some of the topics we'll be talking about during the course of the semester. So again, if you have questions or you need something repeated, feel free to use the hand raising icon at the bottom middle of your screen, or go ahead and type it into the chat box. All right, so we hear a lot about the terms government and politics. And for some reason, people seem to think they're interchangeable. When people talk about government, sometimes they mean politics and vice versa. But they actually mean different things. Government is the institutions. So it's the White House, the Supreme Court, Congress. Government is the formal institutions that are used to help run a country. Politics is the fight over who's going to run the government. So it's the fight over people and leadership. It's the who gets what, when, and how. So again, government is the institutions. Politics is the people. And the reality is that we don't trust our government. In 2017, only 18% of Americans trusted the government most of the time. In 1960, it was 75%. So we're talking about a huge decrease since the 1960s. Part of that is because of things like Watergate and the Vietnam War, the Clinton administration. So the reality is we don't trust our government very much. 67% of us only trust the government some of the time. And we don't necessarily trust them to do the right thing. Now, that number will go up after a crisis. For example, right after 9/11, trust in the government went very, very high. But once the shock of 9/11 wore off, that percentage went back down again. We also don't believe that we can have effect on what the government does. 74% of Americans don't think that government officials care what we want. So the majority of us think Congress doesn't listen to us, President doesn't care what we think, we don't have an impact on what our government does. And unfortunately, while that's cynical, sometimes it is hard to see that the government is doing what's right for us if it doesn't feel like it. So it's understandable in some ways. Using the hand raising icon, quick show of hands, how many of you think that our members of Congress actually care what we want or what we think? Yeah, that's understandable. It really is. Any questions before we move on? Okay. We also, in addition to not trusting our government, we don't know a lot about how our government works. In 2015, 91% of people could identify a leader like Martin Luther King Jr., but they couldn't name a Supreme Court justice. Only about 31% of people could name all three of the branches of government. And only 27% of Americans knew what it takes for Congress to override a presidential veto. It takes a 2/3 majority in both chambers. So unfortunately, our political knowledge is a bit lacking. And some of this you'll see if you watch like Stephen Colbert or Jimmy Kimmel, where they go out on the street and they show people pictures and they have no idea who they're talking about. It's kind of funny, but it's also fortunately a bit sad. And this lack of knowledge can really, really hurt us. If we're not aware of what our government is doing, then we may not be aware of the fact that we may be losing something. So there was a Supreme Court case to determine the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, as it was later nicknamed. When Americans were asked their opinion about the case, only 27% of Americans even knew there was a Supreme Court case. And yet, if the Supreme Court had ruled the act unconstitutional, millions of Americans would have lost their health insurance. So the fact that people didn't know that this was going on was concerning because they didn't know that they would lose their health insurance. We've also seen a bit of a lack of concern about the restrictions on civil liberties post 9/11. We seem to be okay with trading some of our liberties for security. For example, the fact that we're willing to go through a body scanner at the airport, to take off our shoes, to not bring food or drink into the airport, which is a little problematic, right? There has to be a fine balance between national security but also personal liberty. And we've been flirting with that line quite a bit since 9/11. In reality, we also need to know more about how our local government works. Most people wouldn't know whom to call if they lost water in their house one morning. Quick show of hands for the hand raising icon. How many of you would know whom to contact if you woke up one morning and you had no water in your house? Okay. You would need to contact your local water company, so like City of Weslaco Water, City of Mercedes, etc. Because unfortunately, sometimes if they're doing repair work or a water main breaks, they're not very good about letting people know. And I've woken up some morning and I don't have water and I've gone, what happened to my water? So we should know whom to contact if we lose water or electricity, or if there's a boil order and we can't drink the water. So it's important to know how federal government works. It's also important to know how our local government works because that's the government we'll be in the most contact with. Okay, any questions before we move on? Okay, so let's test your political knowledge. Using the chat box, please tell me, who is this gentleman on the far left? That's fair, Eileen. Okay. Anyone else want to take a guess who that is? Okay, so that's Senator Ted Cruz, one of our senators all the way here on the left. And you guys got a little ahead of me because one of you already identified this woman, Elizabeth Warren, who ran for president. She's a senator from Massachusetts. So makes sense that you would kind of know who she is because she's been in the news a lot. And if you watched any of the Democratic Party debates, you would have seen her on stage. Any guesses who this gentleman in the robe is? I've only had one class where a student actually knew who this was. This is Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer. Not as famous compared to some of his colleagues because he's more of a moderate, but he is one of the Supreme Court justices. And this gentleman, all the way to the right, is the mayor of McAllen, Jim Darling. So you guys did about as well as my classes usually do. I usually get people who recognize Ted Cruz, a few on Elizabeth Warren, only one person who's ever gotten Justice Breyer, and nobody's been able to guess the mayor of McAllen. And this isn't uncommon. We can identify leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but we couldn't pick our city council lineup. I'm guilty of this too. I think if someone showed me a photo of the mayor of Weslaco, I'm not sure I would know who that is. So it's not uncommon to know big names, but not to know the people who aren't in the news all the time. Most people have difficulty naming one Supreme Court justice, let alone all 9 of them. So don't feel bad. You're about on par with the majority of Americans. This is pretty common. Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the different types of government to help you kind of understand globally the types of governments that are common around the world. An autocracy is a type of government where it's ruled by one person. So an example of this is Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a country in West Africa, and for 40 years, one man named Robert Mugabe was the leader of the country. No one really ran against him for president, and anyone who did would, quote unquote, disappear before the election. Now, recently he was overthrown in a coup, but for 40 years he was the only person serving as president of this country. So again, this is where one person rules and no one else is allowed to run. If there is an opposition candidate, it's usually a pretty fraudulent election. An oligarchy is a form of government where it's run by a small group like the wealthy or the military. China is an oligarchy. It's run by the Communist Party. But not just anyone can run for office. It's not enough to be a member of the Chinese Communist Party. You have to get permission from someone higher up the ladder within the party to run for their Congress. You have to get permission from the wealthier, more connected Chinese politicians to run for office. So the country is controlled by the wealthy and the military. The people really don't get a say in what happens in their country. Next, we have democracy, which is, of course, rule by the citizens. Democracy is not the most common type of government in the world. Only only about 40% of the global population actually lives in what's considered a democracy. Now, there are countries that have tried to make a movement towards democracy, but the reality is it's not what the majority of the global population lives in. Another form of government is called an authoritarian regime. This is where the government essentially does whatever it wants. So in Myanmar, which used to be called Burma and is in Asia, the military for the past couple of years has been committing genocide against a minority Muslim population called the Rohingya. And there are no controls in the country to stop them. There's no real ability for the citizens to oppose what the government is doing. Another example of this is the Philippines. The current president basically said, if someone is a drug dealer, drug user, or suspected of being a drug dealer or drug user, you can murder them on the streets with no penalty. So people have been shot to death in the middle of the Capitol with no penalty. They walk up to someone, they shoot them, they say they were a drug dealer, and that's it. There's no repercussions for this. And the last form of government is called totalitarian. This is where the government controls every aspect of the country. The economy, education, healthcare, the media. All of this is controlled by the government. So Syria is an example, as is North Korea. In North Korea, there's no independent press. There's the official state media that promotes propaganda. The government sets the education standards, determines who gets to live where, and it's very quick to throw people in jail for speaking out against the regime. So keep in mind, again, democracy is not the most common type of government in the world. There are a fair number of democracies, including the United States, but the globe overall still has a lot of very repressive governments comparatively. Okay, any questions before we move on? Okay. Okay. So in terms of representative democracy, that's basically what we are. We are a representative democracy. The citizens choose the policymakers. So we vote for the members of Congress who then pass the federal laws. We don't directly vote on federal law. We vote for the people who pass the policy. So on the federal level, it is representative democracy only. On the state level, we do have what's known as direct democracy. Citizens will vote directly on the laws and the policies. So at the state and the local level, we can vote on ballot initiatives. Here in Texas, direct democracy is us voting on the amendments to the state constitution. So last November, yes, after the legislative session, there were 10 constitutional amendments proposed that were voted on by us. 9 of the 10 amendments were added to the state constitution. So that's our direct democracy, is voting on state constitutional amendments. In other states, citizens can directly propose a constitutional amendment. For example, marijuana laws. Recreational marijuana is legal in states like California, Colorado, Washington, and Massachusetts. Medical marijuana is legal in states like Michigan and Florida, and those were voted on by the people in the states. So if it's something like legalizing marijuana, increasing the local minimum wage, those we get to vote on directly. There's also the belief in what's called pluralism, that all interests should be represented and should be allowed to have an influence on the government, that every group should have the chance to try and persuade the government to see their point of view. Now, obviously, not every interest can get represented. There's always going to be winners, there's always going to be losers. Not every group can win all of the time. And we also have to deal with the fact that some groups are going to win more often than others. Larger interest groups with more money, they're going to have a little bit more influence compared to smaller groups. But the idea is, at least, if we form some kind of group, if we band together and all push for something, we should have the right to try and influence Congress to see our point of view. Any questions? No? Everyone's good? Okay. Demographically speaking, in the United States, when it comes to race, a little over 3% of the population identifies as more than one race. In 2005, the census started allowing people to mark more than one race on the form. So you could now say that you are Hispanic and white, or African American and Hispanic, or Asian and white. Because for a lot of people, of course, they don't necessarily identify as one race. There's a lot of people who are biracial, multiracial, so we get a better idea of race and ethnicity if we allow people to check more than one box. In terms of our foreign-born citizens, about 13.5% of the population is born outside of the US. The majority of them come from Latin America and the Caribbean, and about 4 out of every 10 foreign-born citizens come from Mexico and Central America, which makes sense. They're connected to us through land. You don't have to cross an ocean to get here. And of course, there are issues with undocumented immigrants. It's estimated that there are about 12 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. It's impossible to get an accurate number because, of course, people aren't necessarily going to step up and say, I'm here illegally. So the best estimate is about 12 million. And of course, we have to deal with questions like, can they get a driver's license? In states like California, they can. Can they have access to health care? Undocumented immigrants, by law, do have the right to seek emergency medical treatment. Do we educate their children? There's a lot of back and forth on what to do about undocumented immigrants. Do we create a path to citizenship? What do we do for people who were brought here as children and had no say about crossing the border illegally? So there's still a lot of debate surrounding the issue of undocumented immigration and what we do about that. Religiously, we are moving away from identifying with a particular religion. About 23% of the population no longer identifies with any organized church or religion. So we get people who identify as atheist or agnostic, spiritual but not religious. We're also seeing a decline in the percentage of people who identify as Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish. In 1968, 95% of the population was Judeo-Christian. It's now 72%. So we are seeing a decline in traditional religious identity and more religious identities with religions like Islam, Hinduism, Unitarian Universalists, Buddhists. So we're seeing less of a connection to Catholicism, Protestantism, and Judaism. And also later, we'll talk about a religion that is called the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. You'll get a kick out of that. Okay, any questions before we move on? Okay. We're also an aging society. In 2016, about 15% of the population was over the age of 65. That number is going up. The biggest generation in modern history is the baby boomers. And the baby boomers were born from 1945 to 1960. So they're the post-World War II generation. And they're reaching retirement age. So we are going to have issues with trying to pay for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid as the population gets older. Our median age has also increased to a little under 38 years. There's two reasons for that. One, the graying of the baby boomers, and two, the decline in the birth rate in the United States. The birth rate has significantly declined since the 1960s, and young people today are either delaying having children or they're not having children at all. And this is a global phenomenon. In Asia, they're facing what they call a graying tsunami, where it's not a one-to-one replacement. So it's not one person entering the workforce for every person leaving. The population's getting older and the birth rate has gone down. So our population, statistically speaking, is getting older, and that will likely increase. And just so you know, they blame millennials and Generation Z for the declining birth rate, so another thing they like to blame us for. So the reality is our country, the world, is pretty much getting older because birth rates have declined significantly. Geographically, 82% of Americans now live in urban areas. Obviously, there are still farmers and ranchers, But more people are living in cities. We've seen a shift away from agriculture and more towards jobs in technology, working for companies like Amazon or Apple or Google. So what this means is the Senate does tend to overrepresent rural interests rather than urban interests, because Texas gets 2 senators, but so does Montana. But Montana doesn't even have half the population of Texas. So the reality is urban areas are underrepresented in the Senate. Socioeconomically, it's a weird picture as well. The top 1% of Americans, which means the people who earn the most money in the United States, think Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, earn 20.3% of all of the annual income created in the United States every single year. And the top 10% of the wealthiest in the United States earn about 50% of the total income. So we're talking a pretty significant income gap in the United States. Population-wise, we're sitting at a little over 300 million Americans. We'll get a better count with the next census. The reality is that about 15% of Americans now live in poverty. There's a shrinking middle class, and the members of Congress are stretched pretty thin. The average House member represents a little over 700,000 people. The founders of the Constitution didn't want them to have to represent more than 30,000 people. So for us to cut down on the number of constituents an average member of Congress represents, we'd probably have to double the size of the House of Representatives. Good luck getting that done, right? And I don't think most people would support doubling the size of the House of Representatives. Okay, any questions or comments before we move on? Yes, Eileen.
Yes, just real quick. Before we started, I tried to open up this PowerPoint on my own, but it didn't allow me. It said that I had to download an application. By any chance, would you be able, are we going to have access to this PowerPoint later or no?
Yes, it's up in Blackboard. You should be able to have access to it in the class.
Okay, thank you.
It's up in Blackboard, yeah. And if you still have trouble accessing it, let me know.
I will, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to touch a little bit on American political culture. And what this is the values and the beliefs and the attitudes. It's how we answer the question, what does it mean to be an American? It's the answer you'd get no matter pretty much whom you asked, right? If you asked a farmer in Iowa, a pot dealer in California, and a professor in Texas, you get similar answers. And one of them, of course, is liberty, right? We like to talk about the freedom that we have as Americans, that we can criticize our government, that we can speak out against injustice, that we can go on Twitter and say, hey, Senator Cruz, why aren't you doing your job? Or, Mr. President, what are you doing to tackle these issues? So we value that very much. We value the freedom to criticize our government, to speak our minds, to say what we want to say. And we value our personal and economic freedoms, the ability to open our own business, open a taco truck or a nail salon, or a franchise for T-Mobile, the ability to choose when or if we want kids, or whom we're going to marry. And there's a lot of support for freedom of speech and freedom of the press. But we get into a bit of debate about the need for national security versus individual liberties. And we've seen that quite a bit in the war on terror. So a good example of this is the San Bernardino shooting in California in 2016. A married couple walked into an office party, opened fire, and killed about 14 people in the office. They were then killed by the police who were responding to the shooting. The FBI wanted to get into the shooters' phones to see if this was part of a larger plan, but they couldn't because the phones were locked. So they asked Apple to unlock their iPhones, and Apple said no. Apple said, if we unlock the phone for you, it opens the door for any request for a phone to be unlocked. So they said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to violate our customers' privacy. So the FBI took them to court, and then they were able to open the phones on their own, and they dropped it. But Apple came out the winner in that dispute. The customers of Apple were happy that they weren't going to just give in to a demand from the federal government, that they were willing to protect their consumers' privacy. So there's been a lot of back and forth on that issue and issues like NSA wiretapping, TSA, how TSA agents behave, things like that. We also tend to believe that the government shouldn't really interfere into the economy, that a business works best when it's left alone. Capitalism is very popular in the United States, right? There's a lot of support for laissez-faire capitalism. We also believe in the idea of equality, that everyone should be allowed to succeed as much as they can, that any one of us could invent the next Facebook, or form the next Imagine Dragons, or become president of the United States, that we should all be allowed to succeed as far as we can in life. So we believe in liberty, freedom, and equality. And these are pretty universal concepts that you would find people sharing if you asked them what it meant to be an American. We also believe in the idea of political equality, that we should all be able to participate equally in the political process. And voting essentially is equal. Obviously, you have to be 18, you have to be a citizen, but most people do have the right to vote. Now, you do lose the right to vote if you're in jail, and in a lot of states, if you're convicted of a felony, you lose the right to vote for a period of time or perhaps permanently. But most Americans have the right to vote. But access to participation isn't equal. It's pretty well known that the more money you have, the more access you have to politicians. If you can afford to donate a couple $1,000s to a politician, you're going to have more access than someone trying to just speak to them off the street. So it's a good idea in principle. Reality, it's a little bit more complicated. In terms of economic equality, there's a little bit less support for this. There's still a belief by some people that if you fail, it's your own fault. You didn't try hard enough. You didn't work hard enough. You have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You have to, go to school and get an education. So there's still some back and forth on whether or not we should guarantee economic equality. There's also questions on issues like how we fund education. Education is funded through property taxes. Obviously, a school in Beverly Hills is going to be much nicer than a school in Compton. Is that fair? That's still debatable, right? There's still a lot of debate around that issue. There's also debates about equality in our private lives. On the one hand, we don't want the government telling us what to do. On the other hand, you do get questions about if the government should legislate morality. Does the government have the right to restrict abortion? Or tell a same-sex couple that they can't get married? Or restrict access to birth control? There's a lot of back and forth on that as well. We also, unfortunately, have the dubious distinction of having the largest income gap in the developed world. And a lot of that is tied to our tax system. Throughout most of Europe, the very, very wealthy pay 60 to 70% in income tax. They don't pay that here, right? There's a lot of loopholes and a lot of tax breaks they can take advantage of. So we do have the largest income gap in the developed world. And that does lead to questions about, well, what should we do to try to fix that? When surveyed, 57% of Americans believe that the government should do more to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. And 74% of Americans think that corporations have too much power, that there's too much power in the hands of Amazon and Walmart and Google. Where we don't agree is on how to fix the problem. Do we increase taxes on corporations? Do we put restrictions on them? Do we guarantee a basic universal income for Americans? We agree there's a problem, but we can't agree on what to do about that problem. So that's where we kind of get stuck. Okay, any questions or comments? Yes, Eileen.
When you mentioned or gave the example of voting on state constitutional amendments, what type of democracy was that?
Direct democracy.
Okay, I just missed that. I don't know why earlier I just felt a little bit shy, but I'm like, I need to figure this out because then I'm gonna not know.
Yeah, no, please feel free to ask questions. And if you need me to repeat something, don't hesitate to ask.
Sorry to go so far back. Thank you.
No, that's fine. That's absolutely fine.
Thank you.
Okay. So in terms of how our democracy works, we do use the rule of popular sovereignty. We do hold our politicians accountable, right? If we don't like what President Trump is doing, we can vote him out of office in November. If we're unhappy with Senator Cornyn, who's up for re-election in November, we can vote him out. We can let our politicians know we don't like this. We can call Senator Cruz's office and say, why aren't you voting for this unemployment relief? Why aren't you voting for this? And so it does give us some power. Politicians don't want to be told we're voting for someone else in the next election. And if they get enough of a response from their constituents, they're going to have to think long and hard about what they're going to do. We're also a system of majority rule minority rights. Now, the government tends to follow the preferences of the majority, but they're also going to protect the rights of minorities. They're going to protect the rights of Muslim Americans to open a mosque somewhere. They're going to protect the rights of people on death row, right? We're not going to execute someone for burglary. And if we do execute someone, we're going to try to make sure that the law is applied fairly, right? That we're not executing an innocent person. We're going to protect the rights of the minority opinion and the minority population. So it's majority rule, but also the knowledge that minority rights and opinions have to be protected as well. And there are some concerns about the role of money in politics. It's extremely expensive to run for office. In 2016, and what's known as the general election cycle, from August to November of 2016, in that 3-month period alone, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump spent a combined $1 billion in that part of the election. To run for Senate, you're looking at a minimum of about $30 million. It's extremely expensive to run for office. And that makes it hard for people to run. And it does make our politicians more interested in who can help them raise the money. Now, it's not a great system in that sense. And we do have issues with voter turnout. In 2008, about 61.5% of voters showed up. That was the highest it had been since 1980. But in 2016, it was a little under 56%. Now, part of that was because in 2016, these were the 2 most disliked candidates in modern history. But the reality is, voters don't necessarily show up. For a midterm election, which is when we re-elect the House and part of the Senate, we're lucky to get 30% of eligible voters. People don't necessarily show up to vote. We have the right to vote, but getting people to the polls, that's a different matter. Yes, Eileen.
When I was younger, a lot of my friends would always say, "No, you don't have to vote because your vote doesn't really count."
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that the millennials these days think that our votes don't count? So that also stops a lot of people that are young from voting.
That's a great question. I think it's twofold. One, the reality, of course, that one vote is probably not going to make a difference in a presidential election. And 2, the fact that in this century we've had 2 elections where the winner of the popular vote is not the president. The Electoral College essentially picks the president, and that's 538 people. So for a lot of young people, when they're looking at this, they're going, well, my vote doesn't matter because it comes down to the Electoral College. And also, my one vote isn't going to make a difference. My vote's not going to decide the outcome of the election. And another part of it, I think, too, is it's hard for people to take time off on election day to go vote, right? If you have kids, if you have school, if you have work, how do you make time to vote? How do you get out to the polls? I think it would really help if we had a national holiday on election day where most people didn't go to work. Maybe more people would participate at that point. So I think it's partly just kind of the logic of it just doesn't make sense to some young people. Having said that, my response to most people is to say, well, if you don't vote, then you can't complain about who wins, right? If you don't show up on election day and then politicians turn around and do something you didn't want, well, where were you on election day? Politicians don't take young people as seriously because we, and I'm including myself in this, don't show up to vote in as high of numbers compared to senior citizens. If we showed up in a large enough number and actually participated, they would have to listen to us. So for us to get somewhere, we do have to show up to vote. So we have to put aside the fact that our one vote may not make or break the election, because sure, one vote might not, but 1 million votes, 2 million, 5 million, who knows? Any other questions? That was a great one, Eileen. Thank you. Okay. There's a lot of disagreement, of course, between Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, younger people, older people, but there's some opinions that we have in common. A small majority of Americans think the federal government has too much power. They would prefer to see more power being given to the states. And we do see between Democrats and Republicans high levels of support for Social Security. 86% of Republicans and 95% of Democrats want Social Security to be fully funded. It's the rare politician who says we should cut Social Security spending, and they usually don't get reelected if they say that. There's also about 92% support by both Democrats and Republicans for funding transportation, repairing roads, putting in high-speed rail, more public transit. So when Congress is debating these kinds of issues, there's pretty high-level bipartisan support within Congress. So there's some areas where there's a bit of agreement between the parties. It's pretty rare these days, but it does still exist. But an interesting contradiction is the fact that on the one hand, Americans want a smaller government. On the other hand, they want the government to spend more and create new programs. The reality is you can't have both. If you create new programs like universal health care, the government has to increase in size to handle the demand for this program. So basically, you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you want a smaller government, you're going to have to cut spending. If you want more programs, you're going to have to deal with the fact that the government's going to have to expand, not contract. So it's a weird contradiction. And inevitably, in the end, people would prefer the government expand its spending, not decrease social programs. And while we don't necessarily trust the government, when there's an economic crisis or a natural disaster, we turn to our state and federal government for support. Hurricane Laura is hitting the Gulf Coast really hard right now. It hit Louisiana as a Category 4 before it went inland. So there's going to be billions of dollars in damages. And so the people in those areas are going to be looking to Governor Abbott, Governor Edwards of Louisiana, President Trump, and FEMA to help them after this crisis. We look to them to help us rebuild our homes, deal with flood damage, open up businesses again. Right after 9/11, there was a huge spike in patriotism and government support. Everyone, not everyone, but the majority of American people were on board with what Congress was doing. So when there's a crisis, we look to the government to solve our problems. We don't have to trust them, and we don't have to really like them that much, but we do rely on them in times of crises. We expect them to help us when the economy fails, or a hurricane hits, or a tornado. They're our first contact after a disaster. So we do need the government. We don't have to like them, but we do need them. All right, any questions on that? All right, so I'm going to ask you the same question I asked my class this morning. Do you think the country is heading in the right direction? Do you think that this country is handling things well? Yeah. Okay. So, if one of you wouldn't mind sharing, what are some of the things that you think have gone wrong? What are some of the things that you think are issues we need to be working on? Okay, social injustice. Yeah, there was just that shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin, right? And then the young man who took a gun and went in and killed two people at a protest. Yeah. Yeah, I'll tell you the same thing I told my other class. I think part of the problem is we've lost the ability to talk to the other side, right? It's now like an echo chamber where people are screaming at each other. You're a racist, you hate the cops, you are, you dirty traitor or whatever, right? We've lost the ability to really talk to the other side, to have a civilized debate, to agree to disagree, to have a civilized discussion on an issue. Um, and part of that's reflected in our leadership, right? It doesn't help that Republicans and Democrats in Congress won't talk to each other, won't work with each other. The Speaker of the House won't work with the President, and vice versa. So it doesn't help that our government isn't reflecting what it should, right? They're not working together, so why should we? I do think it makes it harder for us to be able to talk to each other um, and have a conversation that might be difficult, but is worth having. Yes, Eileen.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I'm not really into politics myself, and so even a lot that you've just said today, I've been able to, gain a lot more knowledge that I've never heard some of these things before. But it always seems like a big debate, even between the two. So if we're fighting, how can we, the people, not fight with each other? And it has turned into like this back and forth battle. And I think that over time it's just gotten worse. And even with the coronavirus, once you know, it finally was in the US, we couldn't even be uniform with one simple thing as a mask. And then people felt violated. Like, why do you make me cover your face? So then now it's not even a health issue. Now it's a totally different perspective of you taking away someone's right to show their face. So it's just really hard.
It is. I agree. Yeah. And I mean, admittedly, sometimes I'll get, a little bit annoying and I'll come back at someone and I'll be like, you're wrong and here's why you're wrong. And, it's hard not to get passionate about some of these subjects. It's hard not to, want to speak up. But I've seen debates where it started off as a disagreement between two people and descended into name calling and bullying. And you're like, how did you get from here to here with nothing in between? Like, what happened? Why couldn't you guys just say, you know what, I respect your opinion, but I disagree, and let's just call it a day? Like, what happened to that? Yeah, it just doesn't make sense to me.
And I feel this after the 2016 election, I think a lot of people were in doubt that Donald Trump would actually become the United States president. And when it happened, it was almost so surreal. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know if there was any other president before this time that would tweet or, say outbursts and kind of say things more based on emotion, personal emotion, not, everything sometimes on Twitter seems a little bit dysregulated. And I don't have social media, but it's from what I see from what the news puts out, and that's their connection. Like, it's Twitter. I'm like, is this serious? It's Twitter. So it's just, if that's supposed to be the person, even if we don't trust him, we have to lean on it. It's really strange. And then now that re-election comes, honestly, I don't know what to expect.
Yeah, I mean, the first president to really use Twitter was Barack Obama, but he had an aide who would tweet for him, and then if he wanted to tweet, like, he'd put his initials after it. But it was always someone within the White House who would tweet on his behalf. This is the first president where he controls his own Twitter account, just puts out whatever he wants. And there's a reason you hire someone in your administration to handle your social media, because emotions can get the better of you, and if you let someone who isn't you handle your account, then it's a little bit better. But yes, this is the first president we've had where he controls his Twitter account, and it's him writing pretty much everything that's on his account. Yeah. I think one way or another, this election is going to be written about for decades, right? It's in the middle of a pandemic. We have a president whose opinion is very polarized. We're dealing with issues of social injustice, a stagnant economy, a pandemic. This is going to be an interesting election. And I think it's one that's going to be studied very, very carefully in the future, because it's rare to have an election where there's so much happening at the same time. The last election I can think of where that happened was probably during the Great Depression and World War II. And it's rare to have an election where there's just so many things happening at the same time. You have conflict and illness and a stagnant economy. So there's a lot that I think will have to be unpacked with this election. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens on November 3rd. And there's some political scientists who think we might not know who won on election night. That's only happened a handful of times in history. So if that happens this year, it's going to be very interesting to see what the outcome is at the end of that. Ideally, we would know on election night who won, but if it lingers on like the 2000 election, it could get very, very ugly. So I'm hoping we won't have that, but I'm not keeping my fingers crossed on that. Yes, Eileen.
Where you mentioned the popular vote didn't win. Oh, okay.
Yeah, 2000, we've had 4 elections in history where the winner of the popular vote is not the president. This century it was 2000 and Bush Gore, and then 2016. And that tends to cause a lot of outrage as well, because the people are like, well, we didn't vote for this person. Like, this person should have won. What happened here? So, yeah, that can cause some chaos as well. Okay, any other questions, comments, thoughts? Okay, so next Tuesday we will cover chapter 2. So 10 of you will be in the classroom on Tuesday. The lecture will be recorded and it will be available for all of you. And then on Thursday, of course, we'll switch to the other half of the class. If you have any questions over the weekend, please don't hesitate to email me or call me, and I'll see some of you on Tuesday. Enjoy. Oh, yes, sorry, Rosalinda?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Will we need to be bringing anything to class or just ourselves?
Yourselves, notebook, paper, things like that. You do not have to bring the textbook to class. I know books can get heavy trying to port them back and forth to class. So you don't have to bring the book with you. Just whatever you need to take notes, something to drink if you need it during class, just stuff like that.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yep. Any questions? Yes, Eileen.
Oh. Everyone's going to be wearing a mask though, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you're bringing something to drink, try to bring a straw and try to drink under the mask. But if you can't, it's fine if you take it off for a minute to take a drink and put it back on. That's fine. Yes, sorry, mask. You also have to wear a mask. No homework for this week, Valeria, other than to do the readings. Yeah. Yes, Rosalinda.
Will we be like spaced out or like are the
From what I understand, I haven't seen the classrooms yet. What they've done is they've removed all but 10 of the chairs in the classroom, and I think, yes, they are setting them to be 6 feet apart from each other.
would you have like seating charts or will we just take whatever?
Just sit wherever you want. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
wherever you want. Yep.
All right.
Yes, Eileen.
Do you have a class right before ours? I'm only asking because when my little sister got sick, I kind of just got really freaked out and paranoid. I don't live with her, but still. So, I mean, should I take my Lysol to just spray or something? I mean, or you don't have a class before?
I don't, and that is an excellent question. Here's how it's going to work. When a professor is done teaching the class, they'll flip a sign on the door that says this classroom needs sanitized. Custodial staff will come in and clean the class. So there are no classes back to back in the same classroom. So they'll come in, they'll clean the classroom, and then an hour and 15 minutes later, the next professor will come in. If you want to bring wipes to wipe down the desk and stuff, that's fine. But they're going to be cleaning the classes in between, and there's no classes back to back in the same room. So there will be plenty of time to clean and sanitize.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Any other questions? I know this is confusing. I know there's a lot going on, but they're really trying to do their best to keep everything clean. I'll have hand sanitizer and sanitizing wipes if y'all need one. But yeah, we should be good in that sense. And also, if you're feeling ill and you just don't want to chance it, don't worry about missing class. It will be excused. If you're like, you know what, I'm just not feeling well today, I really don't want to take a chance on coming to class, that's excused. Don't worry about it if you're just not feeling ill. If you're not feeling well, sorry.